My world was one of lines and contours, of measured distances and the precise, undeniable truth of the land. For years, I had pored over ancient vellum and brittle parchment, coaxing forgotten rivers back into their beds, tracing the ghost roads of empires long fallen. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch required for antique maps, found solace in the exactitude of the compass, the unwavering sweep of the ruling pen. I was Reid, a cartographer, and my craft was an anchor in a chaotic world, a testament to order and discovery. Then came the solicitor's terse letter, sealed with a crest I barely recognized. A distant relative, a great-aunt I had met perhaps once in childhood, had passed. Her legacy, unexpected and unsettling, was a remote ancestral estate, a property so far removed from my ordered urban life that it felt like an echo from another century. The accompanying photographs, grainy and faded, depicted a sprawling, decaying manor swallowed by overgrown foliage, its windows like vacant eyes. The journey itself was a descent into a forgotten corner of the world. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to winding tracks barely wider than my vehicle. The air thickened with the scent of damp earth and ancient moss. Trees, gnarled and silent, pressed in on either side, forming a tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly. With every mile, the hum of the city, the comforting drone of human endeavor, receded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches, a sound like dry bones rattling. When I finally reached the estate, the silence was absolute, a heavy blanket pulled over the land. The manor house loomed, a hulking silhouette against a bruised sky. Its stone facade was mottled with lichen, its slate roof sagged in places like a weary shoulder. The gate, rusted and half off its hinges, groaned a protest as I pushed it open, a sound that seemed to awaken something in the deep shadows of the overgrown garden. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, like wet ash and forgotten paper, clung to the air. Sunlight, strained through grimy panes, painted weak stripes across faded wallpaper and draped furniture. Each step I took stirred motes of ancient particles into a shimmering dance. I moved through the echoing rooms, my presence feeling like an intrusion, a clumsy disruption in a long-held vigil. Every object seemed imbued with a forgotten history, a silent story waiting to be told. It was in a small, seldom-used study, buried beneath a heap of yellowed ledgers and brittle correspondence, that I found it. A wooden box, unassuming, yet heavier than its size suggested, carved with a simple, almost crude knotwork pattern. Inside, nestled on a bed of aged velvet, lay the map. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered. Not paper, but some incredibly thin, treated hide, supple yet resilient, the color of dried blood. Its dimensions were generous, requiring both hands to unfurl, revealing an intricate, almost obsessive depiction of the estate's immediate surroundings. Every contour, every gnarled oak, every shift in elevation was rendered with breathtaking precision. The lines were impossibly fine, etched with a skill that bordered on the arcane. This was not merely a map, it was a devotion. Yet, it was incomplete. And scattered across the otherwise pristine surface were symbols I couldn't decipher, spiraling glyphs, jagged markings that resembled nothing in any cartographic lexicon I knew. They seemed to pulse with a subtle, internal energy, drawing my eye, hinting at a language just beyond my grasp. This was an anomaly, a challenge to the very foundation of my understanding. A memory, unbidden and sharp, sliced through the quiet of the study. I saw myself, just weeks prior, standing alone in the vast, echoing expanse of a shopping mall after closing with lights still on. The fluorescent glow, usually harsh and bustling, was now a sterile, unblinking sentinel over empty storefronts. mannequins, frozen in their perfect poses, seemed to watch from glass tombs. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of unseen machinery, a sound that magnified the sense of being utterly alone, yet utterly observed. It was a place designed for human presence, now unnervingly devoid of it, a stage waiting for an audience that would never arrive. The map, too, was a stage, meticulously set, yet with an empty space, a missing act. It demanded completion, a final stroke to its terrible, beautiful design. The incomplete map, clutched tight in my hand, felt less like a guide and more like a taunt. Its ancient parchment, brittle and scarred, whispered of a landscape both familiar and utterly alien. This was where the known world ended, and the map's unsettling blanks began. I moved with the precise gait of a surveyor, eyes sweeping the undulating terrain, my senses attuned to every rustle of the undergrowth, every shift in the light. My boots crunched on fallen branches, their sound echoing too loudly in the profound quiet. My first task was triangulation, a methodical attempt to reconcile the map's existing lines with the physical contours of the land. A gnarled oak, a distinctive cluster of standing stones, these were my anchors. But almost immediately, the discrepancies began to surface, subtle at first, like a tremor in a distant fault line. A rise of land, gently sloping on the map, presented itself as a sharper, more abrupt incline, crowned with a thicket of thorns that seemed to defy the very notion of natural growth. Further in, where the map showed a clear, open meadow, I found instead a dense, almost impenetrable wall of ancient rhododendrons, their glossy leaves reflecting the pale sunlight like polished obsidian. I pressed on, my initial determination hardening into a stubborn resolve. The sun climbed, dappling through the canopy of old-growth trees, but beneath them, the shadows deepened to an unnerving degree. They were heavy, stagnant pools of gloom that seemed to absorb the light, drawing it into themselves, leaving the air around them strangely cool, even frigid. Then, I stumbled upon them. Half buried in a tangle of ivy and moss, a series of rough-hewn stone markers. Not grave markers, not boundary stones, not even the weathered remnants of a long-forgotten wall. They stood at irregular intervals, their surfaces unadorned, their shapes crudely rectangular, as if hewn by hands unaccustomed to precision. Their arrangement made no sense. They didn't form a circle, or a line, or any recognizable pattern. They simply were, jutting from the earth like forgotten teeth, pointing towards nothing, or perhaps, towards everything. A low hum, barely perceptible, seemed to emanate from the very air around them, a vibration that resonated not in my ears, but deep within my skull. Every snap of a twig, every distant cry of a bird, seemed amplified, imbued with a sinister significance. I moved deeper, following a faint, overgrown track that wasn't on the modern survey, but hinted at on the ancestral map with a faint, almost erased line. My breath plumed, a stark white ghost against the green-gray tapestry of the woods. A peculiar sound began to manifest, a faint, rhythmic thrumming, like a colossal, slow heartbeat vibrating through the very ground. It was too low to be animal, too regular to be natural. It pulsed, then faded, then returned, just at the edge of hearing, just beyond the reach of rational explanation. It felt as if the land itself was sighing, a deep, resonant exhalation from beneath the earth. I pushed through a curtain of thorny bushes, emerging into a small, desolate clearing. The trees here were uniform, strangely stunted, their branches reaching inwards, forming a sort of inverted dome. The light, filtered through their dense canopy, took on a sickly, artificial hue. And then, for a disorienting, terrifying moment, the clearing shifted. The trees seemed to elongate, their bark smoothing into polished chrome. The undergrowth flattened, becoming a vast, gleaming floor. My mind reeled. For a heart-stopping instant, I was no longer in the ancestral woods. The air, heavy with the phantom scent of synthetic cleaners and forgotten perfumes, pressed in on me. Then, as quickly as it had come, the illusion fractured. The chrome became bark again, the polished floor reverted to damp earth and tangled roots. The spectral storefronts dissolved back into the dense, encroaching trees. What was that? A trick of the light? A sudden, overwhelming fatigue? Or was the estate, with its ancient secrets and unsettling discrepancies, beginning to fray the very edges of my perception? The peculiar sound, that low, resonant thrum, persisted. The stone markers, half hidden in the gloom, seemed to watch me. The map in my hand now felt less like a tool for discovery and more like a key to a door I was perhaps never meant to open. Then slightly hesitant, tremor. I ignored it, blaming the draft from the ill-fitting window frame. Days bled into a monotonous cycle of meticulous cartography and gnawing unease. I charted the known, then lingered on the void, the unmapped expanse of my inherited land. The estate, in its decaying grandeur, seemed to press in on me, its very timbers groaning under an unseen weight. When I turned my head, it was always gone, leaving only the dust motes dancing in the slanted sunlight. At first, they were indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind through the eaves, or the settling creak of ancient wood. But gradually, a pattern emerged, a faint, sibilant murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. It was never distinct enough to form words, only a persistent, low hum, like a forgotten conversation just beyond the threshold of understanding. Yet, the moment I pulled away, the phantom sound would resume, a mocking echo in the vast, empty rooms. My carefully organized workspace began to betray me. A favorite fountain pen, left precisely beside my inkwell, would migrate to the edge of the desk, its cap askew. A stack of reference books, squared and aligned, would be found slightly askew, as if a careless hand had brushed past them. I blamed myself, my own distraction, the fatigue of endless solitary hours. I even started taking photographs of my desk before leaving the room, a ludicrous exercise in self-policing, meant to prove my sanity. But the camera, too, would lie. The subtle shifts were undeniable. A small, brass magnifying glass I was certain I'd placed on the southern corner of my drawing table would appear on the northern edge. It was maddening. Sleep offered no respite. My nights became a succession of vivid, unsettling dreams. In these dreams, the map in my hand would unfurl, not into a topographical survey, but into a pulsating, organic blueprint, its lines writhing like veins, its symbols shifting into grotesque, unblinking eyes. The map itself, my anchor and my obsession, began to mirror my fracturing perception. I would pore over its faded lines, comparing them to my own meticulous surveys of the visible estate. A small, unremarkable cluster of trees, which I had carefully marked on my own contemporary overlay, seemed to possess a faintly different contour on the ancestral parchment. A barely discernible crosshatch, which I had previously dismissed as a stain or a fold in the aged paper, now appeared to coalesce into a distinct, albeit faint, symbol, something vaguely resembling a stylized root system, or perhaps a gnarled hand. I would rub my eyes, convinced the flickering lamplight was playing tricks, but when I returned to it, the detail, once seen, could not be unseen. It was as if the map was slowly, deliberately, revealing itself to me, layer by agonizing layer. The weight of it all, the isolation, the relentless subtlety, became too much. I needed to see other people, even if only fleetingly. It was late, past 10, when I finally drove my truck away from the gravel path, seeking the artificial glow of civilization. Its vast parking lot was almost empty, a scattering of employee vehicles like lost pebbles on a concrete ocean. I walked past shuttered storefronts, the plastic faces of their display models staring out with vacant eyes. As I walked back through the main concourse, the familiar unease began to creep in. I spun around, my heart giving a single, hard thump against my ribs, but there was nothing, only the endless, empty expanse of the mall. I quickened my pace, my boots echoing unnervingly on the polished floor. Then, I saw it. In the window display of a closed electronics store, among a carefully arranged pyramid of sleek, black headphones, one single box lay slightly askew, rotated a few degrees from its companions. I knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that it had been perfectly aligned when I'd passed it minutes earlier. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the dust or the wind or my own distraction. This was here. This was following me. The rational shell I had built around myself, the carefully constructed edifice of logic, crumbled in that brightly lit, empty space. Back in my study, the map lay open, illuminated by the single desk lamp. The faint, root-like symbol I had dismissed earlier now seemed to pulse with a subtle, internal light, its lines appearing sharper, more defined. The parchment, once merely old, now felt alive, a living skin revealing its hidden, terrible truths. Reid. I was not alone here. And whatever was here, it knew me. My compass, a steadfast anchor in a world of shifting truths, swung its needle with a familiar, comforting lie. That comfort had curdled. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the answers lay not in the land itself, but buried beneath its accumulated history, within the estate's forgotten layers. The library, a mausoleum of forgotten voices, became my sanctuary and my torment. Dust motes, like tiny, agitated spirits, danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy panes. The air, thick with the scent of decaying paper and slumbering wood, clung to my clothes, seeped into my skin. I worked through the nights, a single lamp casting a harsh, accusing glow on the yellowed pages I unearthed. Shelves groaned under the weight of generations, yielding not just ledgers and tax records, but a trove of personal histories, leather-bound journals with faded script, bundles of letters tied with brittle ribbon, and loose, unaddressed notes tucked between the leaves of forgotten novels. My fingers, stained with the grit of ages, traced the elegant, trembling handwriting of my ancestors. Their early entries spoke of prosperity, of the land's bounty. But as the generations progressed, a subtle shift began. The language grew more guarded, the observations more peculiar. Then there were the letters. A series exchanged between a distant relative and a local surveyor in the 1920s detailed inexplicable subsidence in certain parts of the estate, structures shifting on their foundations, and an unnerving hum emanating from the deepest cellars. The surveyor, initially dismissive, grew increasingly agitated, his final correspondence expressing a terrified refusal to set foot on the property again, referencing the maw beneath the fields. The pattern emerged, stark and terrifying, like constellations forming in a black sky. Madness. Disappearances. Strange occurrences. They weren't isolated incidents. They clustered around specific locations, places I recognized. The old well, now sealed and overgrown. The stand of ancient, twisted oaks by the eastern boundary. The collapsed section of the old carriage path. All of them, precisely marked or subtly hinted at on my incomplete map. The map wasn't just a guide, it was a testament. A record. A key. The land wasn't just old, it was active. And whatever stirred beneath, it had claimed my family, generation after generation. A desperate need for external validation, for something to anchor me outside the suffocating history of the estate, drove me from the library. I needed a specific, obscure book on local geological anomalies, one I'd glimpsed mentioned in an old almanac. The nearest place that might carry such a specialized volume, or at least be able to order it with any speed, was a large bookstore in the nearest city, a place I rarely visited. It was late when I arrived, the sky a bruise of purple and gray. The automatic doors hissed open for me with a mechanical sigh, then closed behind me with a soft thud, sealing me inside. The polished floors gleamed under the relentless, fluorescent glare, reflecting my solitary figure back at me, distorted and elongated. Rows of storefronts, their gates pulled down, presented a uniform, metallic face, like sleeping automatons. The air, recycled and sterile, carried the ghostly scent of stale popcorn and chemical cleaners. It was a world utterly devoid of life, yet brimming with an unsettling, expectant energy. I walked, my footsteps unnaturally loud, towards the bookstore at the far end of the concourse. The artificial light, usually so innocuous, felt invasive here, stripping away all warmth, all comfort. My breath plumed faintly in the cool air, a visible sign of my own fragile existence in this dead space. I found the bookstore's entrance unlocked, a sliver of yellow light spilling onto the deserted mall floor. Inside, the aisles were meticulously ordered, the books standing like silent sentinels. A single, unseen employee must have been preparing for the morning, but I saw no one. My eyes scanned the regional history section, my mind still reeling from the ancestral journals. It depicted a geological survey team from the 1930s, standing before a newly excavated trench. And there, etched into the exposed rock face, was a symbol. A crude, spiraling glyph I had seen before. Not on the map, not in the journals, but in a separate, small, leather-bound notebook I'd found tucked into the spine of my great-great-aunt's final, frantic journal. A symbol he had drawn repeatedly, obsessively, in the margins of her descent into madness. The book dropped from my numb fingers, clattering on the silent, carpeted floor. The sound reverberated through the empty store, swallowed by the vast, echoing mall. The symbol, now undeniably linked to the deepest, most unsettling parts of my family's history, burned behind my eyes. The map was more than a guide, it was an invitation. And whatever lay buried beneath my ancestral land, it had been waiting. Waiting for me. The pattern, once a whisper of possibility, now screamed its truth in the quiet of the estate. Madness. Disappearances. Strange occurrences. The more I traced the old estate map, cross-referencing it with the fragmented journals, the more the connections solidified. They weren't isolated incidents, no, not anymore. They clung like venomous tendrils to specific locations, the old well, now sealed and overgrown, the stand of ancient, twisted oaks at the property's forgotten edge, even the very foundations of the house where I now stood, the floorboards groaning underfoot as if burdened by a colossal, unseen weight. Sleep offered no true reprieve. The visions, once confined to the shadowed chambers of my rest, now bled into my waking hours. I saw hands, gnarled and earth-stained, reaching, always reaching, from fissures in the ground, from the murky depths of the well. No longer the indistinct murmurings that had plagued my periphery, they coalesced into intelligible, menacing threats. Dry as parchment, would rasp against my ear, its breath like grave dust. The debt is due. Sometimes, it was a chorus. A low, guttural chanting that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, speaking of forgotten pacts and an insatiable hunger. It spoke of me, of my lineage, of a terrifying inheritance I was only just beginning to comprehend. My determination, once a shield, began to feel like a flimsy paper target. The house itself became a stage for its malice. A heavy tome, a century-old atlas I'd been consulting, would slide from the shelf with a soft thud, landing open to a page depicting the estate's earliest, most unsettling surveys. The antique brass bell on the mantel, untouched for decades, would emit a single, mournful chime, its reverberations fading into an unnatural quiet. Indistinct form in the periphery of my vision, a tall, skeletal silhouette that vanished the instant my gaze fell upon it directly. I could not deny it any longer. This was no trick of light or mind. Something malevolent stirred within these walls, and it was growing bolder. The isolation, once a quiet comfort for my meticulous work, transformed into a suffocating cage. I had to reach out. I had to tell someone, anyone. My phone, which had been unreliable for days, finally gave up the ghost. No signal. The landline, too, was dead, a dial tone refusing to bloom in the receiver. Desperation gnawed at me. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my car keys, and drove. A beacon, I thought, a fragile hope. Its vast, empty expanse, usually bustling, was utterly deserted. The automatic doors stood closed, reflecting my own desperate image back at me. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile, unsettling brightness, illuminating the vacant corridors, the ghost of commerce, the hushed displays behind plate glass. Not a single car moved in the lot, no security guard patrolled, no cleaning crew was visible. It was like stepping into a perfectly preserved diorama of human absence. I tried the doors, pushing against the cold metal, but they held fast. There was no one. Not a soul. I pulled out my dead phone, its screen a blank mirror, then slammed it against the dashboard in a futile surge of rage and despair. I tried a colleague, an old acquaintance from the Historical Society. From my home computer, no internet connection. The satellite dish, I noticed, seemed to have shifted, its angle askew. Each failed attempt chipped away at my resolve, leaving me more exposed, more vulnerable. I was isolated. Terribly, utterly alone, and it knew. Madness. Disappearances. Strange occurrences. They weren't isolated incidents, but rather a sequence, a grotesque liturgy performed across generations. For days, the air in my study had grown thick with the scent of aged paper and my own rising anxiety. My fingers, stained with charcoal and ink, trembled as I ran them over the faded vellum. A recurring symbol, almost imperceptible, hidden within the flourishes of the map's border, had gnawed at me. It was a knot of lines, a tangled glyph that appeared in the margins of the earliest journals, described by my ancestors as the bind. The map, initially a quest for knowledge, had become a tightening noose. It was not a guide to a hidden treasure, nor a forgotten boundary marker. It was a diagram of confinement. Each line, each curve, each shaded area, no longer represented a physical feature of the land, but rather an intricate, failing system of restraint. The estate itself was a cage. The journals spoke not of guarding a secret, but of maintaining a prison. My ancestors, in their own cryptic entries, had alluded to the slumbering hunger, the buried vastness, and the thing that would drink the light. The map, in its precise and terrifying detail, marked the points of a colossal, subterranean seal. A barrier, ancient beyond reckoning, holding back something utterly inimical to life. And the unsettling part, the truly soul-shattering revelation, was the increasingly faint lines, the smudged borders, the annotations by increasingly desperate hands. The integrity fails, the stone weeps, the earth breathes differently. The seal was weakening. The air in the study felt too thin, too heavy, all at once. My mind, a frantic swarm of bees, demanded a different kind of stimulation, a stark contrast to the decaying grandeur. I snatched my car keys, the jingle a jarringly normal sound, and drove without conscious direction, letting the road decide my path. The stark artificiality of it was a perverse comfort. The vast parking lot was a barren expanse, my car a lone sentinel under the sickly yellow glow of the sodium lamps. Fluorescent tubes cast an unforgiving light on polished tile floors, reflecting an endless, empty corridor of storefronts. Their stillness was uncanny, more unsettling than any ghost. My eyes traced the clean, geometric lines of the architecture, a stark counterpoint to the organic, twisting horror I had just unearthed. But even here, the revelation clung to me like a shroud. The mall's quiet was a superficial piece. My own thoughts, unbidden, continued to unravel the terrible implications. The glyphs, the fragmented lore, the geographical markers on the map, they weren't just about what was buried, but why I was here. My lineage. The journals, those desperate, fragmented records, hinted at a bloodline tied to the maintenance of the seal. A responsibility, passed down through generations, often ignored, sometimes embraced, always with a terrible cost. The entity beneath the estate, whatever it was, had been stirring for a long time. The disappearances, the madness that had claimed my ancestors, the strange occurrences, they weren't random acts of misfortune. They were tremors, emanations, the slow, insidious influence of something ancient and malevolent straining against its bonds. Was I meant to complete the map, to reinforce the failing prison? Or was my presence, my very act of deciphering, merely the final, unwitting step in its release? A sudden, sharp crack, like a distant gunshot, reverberated through the empty mall. My breath hitched. The feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, not from the mannequins, but from something far older, far more patient. The knowledge was a venom in my veins. The map was not an object of study, it was a key. And I, through my own relentless curiosity, had just discovered how to turn it. The weight of generations, of a terrible, unasked-for duty, pressed down on me. I was not just mapping a property, I was mapping my own doom, and perhaps, the unraveling of the world above. I had fled the estate, the oppressive silence of its ancient walls suddenly unbearable, the air thick with an unspoken demand. The automatic doors, usually a bustling maw, parted for me with a sigh, revealing an unnerving tableau. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unwavering glow on polished floors that stretched into an infinite, mirroring expanse. The usual cacophony of commerce was replaced by a profound, echoing hush. Ghostly banners for forgotten sales hung limp from the ceiling. Mannequins, frozen in perpetually cheerful poses, stood sentinel in the glass eyes of deserted boutiques, their plastic smiles mocking the unease that had taken root in my chest. This was not the refuge I sought, it was merely another, brighter cage. You feel it, don't you, Reid? The pull. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, refusing the cliché of pounding. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the frantic flutter. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It was here. It had followed me. The lights above flickered, just once, then settled back into their relentless hum. The pressure intensified, a vice tightening around my cranium. It was a current, an insidious tide attempting to seep into the very marrow of my bones, to claim the space behind my eyes. The sensation was not of being spoken to, but of being invaded. A desperate urge to turn, to run, warred with a paralyzing fascination. Then, a vision, flickering behind my eyelids even as they remained open. It was the land itself, groaning, straining, and I was at the nexus. To the source. The heart. It remembers you. It remembers your blood. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that it was attempting to lure me, not just to a physical location, but to an internal surrender. To allow its tendrils to intertwine with my consciousness, to become the vessel it craved. The estate, the map, my lineage, it was all a pathway, patiently carved through generations, leading to this moment. I felt my will waver, a fragile shield against an overwhelming tide. It was a memory, not explicitly mine, but a fragment inherited, preserved within the deepest recesses of my ancestral memory. It was a ritual. Not one of appeasement, but of containment. A series of markings, specific incantations, and a profound act of severance. The details were fragmented, like ancient pottery shards, but the essence was undeniable. The map, the incomplete lines, the strange symbols, they were not just a guide to its location, but a key to its resealing. But the cost. The countermeasure demanded not just a physical act, but a fundamental sacrifice. It required the severing of the bloodline's connection to the land, an offering of the very lineage that had brought this entity to the surface. It was an act of immense will, a deliberate unmaking of self, to break the ancient covenant. The stakes, suddenly, were crystalline in their horror. It was not merely my sanity on the line, nor even just the fate of the decaying estate. The encroaching presence, the hunger I felt, was far vaster than I had imagined. It sought not just to consume me, but to burst forth, to spread its ancient blight beyond the property lines, into the unsuspecting world. The land was merely the lock, and my blood, the key it had been waiting for. The entity pressed harder, a silent, ravenous roar. Give in, Reid. Become one with the hunger. It is your destiny. No. The word formed in the depths of my being, not spoken, but felt with an intensity that vibrated through my bones. I would not be its conduit. I had seen the path to its resealing, however terrible the cost. I just had to pay the price. And the price was everything. The map, once a riddle etched in fading ink, now pulsed with a terrible clarity within my mind. It was not a path to dominion, nor a blueprint for release, but a diagram of confinement, a grim instruction manual for the undoing of a cosmic wrong. I would not succumb. I would perform the ritual. I descended into the earth beneath the ancestral house, a journey that began not with a grand entrance, but a secret door hidden behind a collapsing cellar wall, revealed only by the map's final, most cryptic glyphs. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil, ancient stone, and something else, a metallic tang, like old blood, subtle yet pervasive. My lantern cast a trembling circle of light, revealing walls of rough-hewn rock, slick with condensation, and a floor that sloped ever downward, uneven and treacherous. Then, without warning, the stone walls dissolved. The air shimmered, and the oppressive scent of decay was replaced by something entirely alien, a synthetic perfume, sickly sweet, mingled with the faint aroma of stale popcorn and disinfectant. The rough-hewn tunnel gave way to polished linoleum, stretching into an impossible distance. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a sterile, bluish glow that seemed to flatten all color, making the world appear like a faded photograph. My lantern, clutched in my hand, felt ludicrously small, its beam swallowed by the artificial luminescence. Shop fronts, their gates drawn, lined the silent corridors like sleeping leviathans. Reflections of the empty space warped in their darkened windows, distorting my own image, stretching my face into a grotesque parody of fear. The silence was not the silence of the earth, but an unnatural, manufactured quiet, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of unseen machinery and the faint, persistent drip of something in the far reaches of the hall. This was its doing. A psychological assault, designed to disorient, to overwhelm with the mundane twisted into the terrifying. What horror could manifest itself in such a sterile, brightly lit cage? A cruel joke, I murmured, my voice lost in the vastness. The emptiness was profound, menacing. I forced myself to move, my boots echoing unnervingly on the polished floor. The mall stretched on, an endless, looping maze of identical corridors and closed shops. I knew, with a certainty that pierced through the illusion, that I was still beneath the estate, that this was merely a veil woven by the entity, but the sheer conviction of its reality threatened to shatter my focus. I focused on the damp scent of earth, the feel of the rough stone beneath my phantom shoes. Then, with a shudder, the illusion dissolved, peeling back like old wallpaper. I was back in the narrow, rock-hewn tunnel, the air heavy with ancient decay, my lantern once again the sole bastion against the crushing black. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. It had been so real. Strange growths, pale and phosphorescent, clung to the walls, shedding a fine, glittering dust that sparkled in my lantern light. Not the familiar, distant murmurs I had grown accustomed to, but voices I knew. My own, distorted, promising oblivion. The voice of a long-dead ancestor, filled with a desperate plea for release. And then, the voice of a colleague, pleading with me to turn back, to abandon this madness, his words laced with a sorrow that tore at my resolve. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head violently, knowing these were not true echoes, but carefully crafted torments. A precipitous drop yawned before me, the path continuing only via a treacherous, crumbling ledge along the wall. Utter blackness. The first spark caught, then another, until the wick glowed, bringing back the feeble light, revealing the precarious ledge, the terrifying drop, and a new horror, etched into the rock face directly before me, a crude, yet unmistakable, carving. It depicted a figure, emaciated and bound, its face contorted in silent agony, at the foot of a monstrous, many-limbed silhouette. This was the true reveal. The map had hidden this final, terrible detail, or perhaps I had simply refused to see it until now. The price of containment was not merely my effort, but a bloody, ritualistic tribute, paid by my lineage, generation after generation. My breath hitched. The entity had demanded a sacrifice, and I had foolishly believed it meant my sacrifice, my life. But it was far more monstrous. It demanded an offering. And the map, in its terrible precision, outlined exactly what that offering must be. The revelation threatened to shatter my resolve, to send me screaming back into the impossible mall, into the relative sanity of madness. But then, a flicker of defiance. If it fed, it could also be starved. If it demanded a cycle, that cycle could be broken. My path was clear, however abhorrent. I would reach the final chamber. And I would end it. The cavern's chill had not merely pierced my flesh, it had etched itself into the marrow of my bones, a cold truth blooming in the desolate space where hope once resided. The resealing, I now understood, was no act of containment but a ravenous, cyclical feeding. The map, my sacred guide, had offered only half-truths, its final lines a deception, or perhaps, in my blind reverence, I had chosen not to see. This revelation had not broken me, not entirely. Instead, it had forged a new resolve, sharper than any blade. If the entity demanded a cycle, I would break it. My awareness, a frayed thread, snagged on the jarring incongruity of my surroundings. The fluorescent tubes above hummed with an unnatural intensity, casting an antiseptic glare over empty storefronts. Their gaudy displays, designed to lure and entice, now leered like vacant eyes, reflecting my distorted image in their dark panes. This was no ordinary mall, it was a stage, twisted in waiting. It was a silent, suffocating scream, a hunger so profound it vibrated in the very air. My hands, trembling but firm, clutched the map. Its parchment, once supple, felt like brittle skin, its intricate lines now pulsing with a faint, internal luminescence. This was the entity's doing, this transposition, this warped reality. But I was a cartographer. I understood patterns, deviations, the hidden logic beneath the surface. I moved, my footsteps echoing with unnerving clarity down a long, deserted concourse. The silence was not empty, it was pregnant with expectation, with a malicious patience. It was the entity, testing, probing, seeking to unravel the threads of my mind. But my focus was absolute. The map. The ritual. This place, this monument to consumption, was not random. It was a mockery, a reflection of the entity's own insatiable appetite, its endless cycle of taking. I saw it now, in the endless rows of mannequins, their blank faces frozen in perpetual longing. In the vacant food court, a mausoleum of forgotten feasts. The entity had chosen this arena, hoping to drown me in its bleak irony. But it had underestimated me. I saw the geometry of its malice, the invisible ley lines it had drawn in this fabricated space. My fingers traced a new path on the map, a complex series of symbols and coordinates I had painstakingly extrapolated from the cryptic marginalia and the land's own tortured history. It wasn't about where to seal it, but how to redirect its hunger, to starve it into dormancy. I needed a focal point, a nexus. My eyes scanned the vast space, seeking the precise intersection of the mall's artificial lines and the entity's spectral influence. I stopped before a large, central fountain, its basin dry, its cherubs chipped and grim. This was it. The heart of this twisted labyrinth. The entity surged then, a wave of despair washing over me, threatening to buckle my knees. Their sacrifices, their desperate attempts to appease, now felt like echoes in my own mind. Its lines flared, a network of crimson and gold against the aged parchment. This was the reveal/discovery. The map was not merely a guide, but a conduit. It was a living blueprint of the entity's true nature, and more importantly, its vulnerabilities. The previous resealings had merely diverted its hunger, not quelled it. This ritual, my ritual, demanded not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of self. With a trembling hand, I produced a small, silver stylus, a forgotten tool from my cartographic kit, now imbued with an unforeseen purpose. I began to draw, following the map's incandescent guidance, extending its lines onto the dry basin, onto the polished floor around me. The air grew thick, vibrating with an unseen force. The lines I drew were not merely symbols, they were conduits, channels for the entity's own power, twisted back upon itself. I was creating a new topology, a cartography of containment that would bind it, not in a cycle of feeding, but in an unbreakable loop of its own making. The ground beneath me began to shudder, a low rumble vibrating up through the soles of my shoes. My hand cramped, my vision blurred. Sweat stung my eyes, but I pushed through the pain, through the crushing mental assault. I could feel the entity's rage, a primal scream that threatened to tear the fabric of reality. But I held on, my grip on the stylus unwavering. The final line. I drew it, a precise, unyielding arc, completing the complex diagram. As the tip of the stylus met the last point, a blinding flash erupted from the map, a silent, internal explosion. The crushing weight lifted. Then, a single, distant fluorescent tube flickered back to life, then another, slowly illuminating the empty concourse. The air was still, utterly silent. The map lay at my feet, its parchment now blank, utterly devoid of any markings, as if it had never been. The silver stylus was gone. I looked down at my hands, at the lines of my palms. They were there, but they felt alien, disconnected. I tried to recall the face of my mother, the warmth of a childhood home, the precise feeling of the sun on my skin. The memories were there, like ghosts, but the feeling, the vibrant essence that gave them life, had been siphoned away. The devastating personal cost. I had banished the entity, perhaps forever, but in doing so, I had offered a piece of myself, the part that felt, the part that connected to the tender realities of the human world. The fluorescent hum was a dull, persistent ache behind my eyes, a counterpoint to the profound, ringing silence that now defined my existence. My own reflection, a gaunt stranger with eyes like bruised fruit, stared back from the glass fronts of boutiques displaying silent mannequins. My clothes, once crisp, were now a rumpled testament to the days, or was it weeks, I had spent in a blur. A ragged tear marred the sleeve of my shirt, exposing a patch of skin where the surface was puckered and discolored, a scar I carried now, a physical manifestation of the struggle. The silence. Here was different from the silence of the estate. There, it had been an ancient, breathing thing, heavy with history and the malevolent presence I had sought to bind. But there was nothing. Only the polished tiles, the gleaming chrome, the silent, beckoning escalators standing still. I had walked away from the estate, or rather, I had stumbled. The final lines of containment, etched with desperate precision, had indeed worked. I had felt the entity recoil, a monstrous, internal groan that had vibrated through the very bones of the land, through my own marrow. Then, an emptiness. A sudden, echoing vacuum where its presence had been. The estate itself was a ruin, not from fire or tempest, but from the raw, elemental force of our struggle. Walls had buckled, ancient timbers had groaned and split, and the very earth around the house had seemed to writhe, leaving fissures like old wounds. There were fragmented memories of roads, of the roar of an engine, of an instinctual need to flee the profound, echoing emptiness I had created. I had driven until the fuel gauge needle trembled on empty, until the need for anonymity, for the mundane, had drawn me to this place. Now, I simply wandered, a ghost in a landscape of forgotten desires, the only living thing in a space designed for crowds. I passed a display of brightly colored toys, their plastic smiles fixed and unsettling in the artificial light. My gaze snagged on a globe, spinning slowly on its stand. The lines of longitude and latitude, so familiar, suddenly seemed incomplete. My mind, once a precise instrument for mapping the known world, now saw beyond the surface. I saw the invisible currents, the hidden conduits that wove through the earth, the very fabric of reality. The lines I had drawn at the estate, the ones that had bound the entity, were not just symbols on a page, they were a deeper truth, a language I now understood, or perhaps, had been forced to understand. This was the cost. The entity was gone, banished from the estate, but it had left its mark not just on the land, but on me. I carried a fragment of its knowledge, an unwanted understanding of the world's hidden anatomy. The world no longer seemed solid, but a fragile skin over a network of unseen energies, a tapestry woven with threads of ancient power. I could almost feel the subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible currents beneath the mundane surface. It was as if a veil had been torn, and what was revealed was not enlightenment, but a profound, unsettling complexity. I stopped before a large, reflective pillar, catching my reflection again. My eyes, once a clear, discerning blue, now held a depth I did not recognize, a knowing that felt too vast, too ancient for my own frame. My breath caught in my throat. The outside world remained blissfully unaware, its consumers dreaming of sales and promotions, while I walked among their empty temples, a silent, solitary custodian of a truth too terrible to utter. And I, irrevocably changed, was now attuned to its monstrous rhythm. The struggle was over, but the aftermath, the profound, desolate understanding, had only just begun. My breath plumed faintly in the chilled, recirculated air, carrying the ghost of a scent, not the cloying perfumes of a department store, but something metallic, like old blood mixed with ozone. I was alone, truly alone, in this mausoleum of commerce, a bizarre purgatory after the earth-shattering confrontation. I remembered the frenetic energy of my cartographic pursuits, the meticulous lines, the precise measurements, the comforting certainty of known boundaries. I walked the length of a deserted corridor, past mannequins frozen in perpetually eager poses, their plastic eyes reflecting the harsh light without comprehension. They were the perfect audience for my silent ordeal, unblinking witnesses to a horror they could never grasp. The air conditioning vents sighed a low, constant drone, a sound that, to my altered hearing, carried the faint, rhythmic thrum of something immense, something beneath the surface of everything. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the steady, if somewhat accelerated, beat of my own heart. Finding the exit was a mechanical act. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, releasing me into the damp, cool embrace of the pre-dawn city. The artificial yellow glow of the streetlights seemed sickly after the mall's relentless brilliance. I inhaled deeply, tasting the exhaust fumes and the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves. It was a familiar world, yet utterly alien. I tried to return to my old life. I went back to my study, the scent of aged paper and ink a comforting balm, but the maps on my desk now seemed trivial, two-dimensional lies. My hand, once so steady, now hesitated above the parchment. The nights were the hardest. Sleep became a fragile truce, easily shattered by the smallest sound. I spoke to a colleague once, a fellow cartographer, about the unusual geological formations in the region. He nodded, offering theories about ancient fault lines and water erosion. I listened, my lips forming polite replies, but my mind was elsewhere, conjuring images of roots that were not roots, of veins that pulsed with something other than blood, of a hunger that had no name. I saw the polite confusion in his eyes, the slight shift in his posture, the subtle withdrawal. He saw a man haunted, a man who had strayed too far from the sensible world of grids and projections. He was right. The truth, the terrible, unshakable truth, slowly solidified within me. My encounter had not been a victory in the conventional sense. I had not vanquished the entity, I had merely contained it. And in doing so, I had paid a price far greater than any material possession. I had sacrificed my peace, my innocence, my ability to see the world as merely matter and light. It was not a physical wound, but a spiritual branding, a constant, gnawing knowledge. The entity had not been destroyed. It merely slept, a colossal, malevolent consciousness slumbering beneath the earth, held in abeyance by what? By the sacrifice. Sometimes, a subtle compulsion would grip me. A sudden urge to visit the estate, not to investigate, but merely to stand on its scarred ground, to feel the faint pulse of its sleeping occupant. I would resist, but the pull was undeniable, a faint, insistent tug at the edges of my consciousness. It was as if I had become a part of its extended awareness, a sentinel, or perhaps, a tether. The line between my own thoughts and a lingering influence became blurred, a terrifying ambiguity that coiled in the pit of my stomach. I knew, with an awful clarity, that the horror was not truly over. It was contained, yes, but it lay dormant, a vast, patient hunger. And I, Reid, was forever bound to it, a living map of its presence, a silent witness to its terrible, unending sleep. The world had not returned to normal, it had simply shifted, revealing the monstrous undercurrents that had always been there, waiting. And I, alone, carried the weight of that terrible knowledge, the quiet, persistent dread, a new beginning forged in the shadow of an ancient, unyielding darkness.